three sort of billboard scale signs. So you can see one of them here, which reads, "How much of love is attention?" There's another one that says, "How much of care is patience?" And one that says, "How much of life is coping?" And then there are some smaller signs. So I'll come back to the "how much of life is coping" image, but there are signs at this scale, which is basically 24 by 36, so 3 feet by 2 feet, that have a series of repeating, slightly altered phrases on them that exist throughout the park, and those signs are double-sided. So there's one thing on the front and something else on the back. There's a series of similar size signs with images on them. So there are 3 of these sort of floating photograph signs throughout the park. And then there are 12 of these tiny garden markers, all of which say different things. And the project is really about kind of having a private experience in public space and the specific intimacies that we engage in when we share a city with other people, and the ways in which sharing a city with other people is almost like being in a family with other people, which is something that I think about a lot, and that I think a lot of New Yorkers have felt, even if they haven't really thought about it in those specific terms.
Great. Thank you for that excellent and very succinct introduction to this extremely complex work.
I figure we'll get into the weeds as we go.
Literally, see, there are some weeds right there.
Literally.
Literally. But yes, I think that one of the things that is interesting about this is the fact that it's in a way creating and reacting to a space so that it is working with the landscape, thinking about the landscape, and trying to both fit in and stand out of a very specific landscape. And there are 2 questions I want to ask. I'm going to start with this one, which is just because we have this image in front of us with this very specific statement that, so in wayfinding, and this happens in a lot of your work, you're using a combination of this poetic, we could call it poetic or indirect language, and there's also a large public gesture of a billboard-sized form of that language, and then these sly tiny interventions. So I can attest that this sign is quite small, you know, you could miss it quite easily. And how do you feel that this relates to other work you've done and to the intention of the work, like the language and the signage and the scale, I guess is how I'm thinking about it.
That's a great question. I mean, so I will say before we move on from the detail of the scale, this sign is 5 inches by 7 inches, right? That's really small. Sorry, that's a totally different project. This sign is 24 inches by 36 inches, right? This sign is 24 inches by 36 inches. This sign is 10 feet by 4 feet. So really, I'm working at these wildly different scales. And in a way, what I love about all of these things is how much they work with and against the landscape. Because it's worth saying that the faces of the billboards are actually mirrored. So depending on where you're standing or how you're walking and looking at things in the park, they can almost disappear at times. Whereas something like this is almost always slightly hidden because of how small it is. And I think when I am engaging with people's understanding of public space, there's a lot that we miss anyway, right? Like different people, because of who they are, how they move through the world, their background, what space they're in, what space they're occupying, how their body is feeling, they'll be attuned to very different things in public space. And I think that there's like cultural blindnesses that come out of certain types of privilege, but I also think that there's these like very specific forms of cultural awareness that are not shared between people who are from different necessarily. And so we like to think of the idea of there being like New Yorkers, and I support the idea of New Yorkers very much, but I also think that New Yorkers are increasingly noticing different things at different times. And so having a project that kind of engages stuff that people could miss is one way that I have of grappling with that, because I think that at any layer of seeing the work, right, it's hard to totally miss the billboards, I'll say that. But I also think there are very few people who have seen the whole project. Even people who have spent quite a lot of time with it have not seen all 24 of the signs. It's not a scavenger hunt. They're not actually hidden, but sometimes they're hard to see. And you know, also in addition to the signs, there's an audio guide, right? And the audio guide doesn't really describe what's happening in the park. It's a totally different other layer of artwork and experience for people. And many people haven't listened to it. So even people who have seen all 24 of the signs may or may not have listened to that other element, which gives you a very different read on the work. And I think as I have grappled with the way that the feelings that I want to produce in art kind of overlay or intermingle with the feelings that I experience a lot in everyday life, that sense that people are always missing things, and that that's neither good nor bad, but that it creates a different set of meaning for different people at different times, is something that I don't want to forget, right? Like there's a way that you can make a really obvious monument project or a really obvious billboard project or a really obvious performance project, and people will say, ah, it was that. And there are certain types of public event or sort of shared cultural memories that are also kind of that. September 11th, which is coming up, is like a strong one for me. And then there's also other types of really extreme situations that are not entirely shared cultural memories. And I think this pandemic is a good example of that, right? Like we are having a shared experience. We're going through something simultaneously that pretty much everyone is aware of. But what that has meant for each of us has varied widely. You know, at the beginning of this, I relocated to be with my partner and his young son. And it's like so many of my friends in New York were saying like, I'm so alone right now. And then everyone I know who lives sort of like in a family situation, especially where they're a caregiver, either to kids or to older people, are like, we're so together right now. And like just that split on its own, we can understand what the other person means, but how it feels during the pandemic is totally different. And I think I've wanted to make works that can engage those multiple registers of feeling simultaneously in a space. Now, Wayfinding doesn't do that for everyone because it's in English, right? And there are Spanish translations of the signs, but it's like a handout you can get. There's no other language translations of the signs. So it does not do that for all people all the time, but at least for English language speakers and readers, maybe there's a chance to have that experience. Does that actually answer what you asked, or did I go kind of left?
Yes. I mean, I think it does actually. I think that it's interesting because we didn't talk about language, but except in, you know, but I do think that in a way it addresses that by addressing how we address each other, like the way that you just spoke about it. I feel like that is a very important part of what you're saying. And what you're saying also brings up a couple things for me. One, an unplanned question, and one which I did plan to ask. And what the first, or one unplanned observation, which is that the siloing of experience, right, is mirrored both in physical experience and through our online experience. And because I work a lot with thinking about how especially socially and civically engaged art intersects with digital practice and with the digitality and the online world, I think that's a very interesting observation that we are like, we're lamenting the fact that we have a siloed online life, and we do, and it's a problem, but it's always been the case, right? We always notice different things, even in the physical world. So it's just a replication and amplification of our already existing silos. And I think that's just something to think about when we're lamenting and trying to address the inequities in one space, to remember that it's always mirroring inequities in another space, and that like highlighting those ways of seeing is a valuable gesture, especially when it doesn't specifically direct you towards what to think, but allows a new way of knowing, right? Which is what I feel like you're kind of trying to get at.
Yeah, I don't usually phrase it in terms of like what to think, but one thing that I think, I work in a lot of different forms, which people in this audience may or may not know. So like working in the sculptural public installation form is actually relatively new for me. This is my first project, certainly of this scale and budget, but also it's kind of my first project of this form, which I don't have a problem with. I'm usually down to try almost anything except painting. But like the thing that I talk about as being a through line in my work is not that I won't tell you what to think, but that I won't tell you how to feel, but I know that I can get you to feel something, right? And that I am certain that that is an element of all of the works that I make, that you will have a changed feeling. And you can tell me what you feel, or you can just remember what you feel. I don't ever really need to know it, but the fact that I've kind of engaged in that emotional level is more what I'm looking for than necessarily what you think or even specifically what you see. And it's both what you feel in yourself and also what you might feel in connection to another person that you're with or in connection to the environment around you. And I think that that's something that your work actually engages in a lot as well, because of the ways that you're kind of modifying public space through shared experience and performance that really ask us to look differently at what we think we already know. And I think you come at it maybe from a different angle, but I'm sort of curious to hear how that resonates with you and your practice, particularly with some of the things like the walking tours for Sunk Shore, or also the street crossing project that I did with you all once, which was a great experience where I was carried across the street, assisted street crossing. You know, things that are based in choreography, but based sort of in like modifying the choreography of everyday life.
Yeah, it's funny when you were saying you know that people will feel something and they can tell you what they feel. That is very resonant for me, because to me, the art form, there are a lot of disciplines I've used, but the real art form is in creating a situation where there is something specific going on without being a statement. So it's specific and it's clear, but it allows so much space. Like I want to leave a lot of space for each person's individual three-dimensional experience, and literally three-dimensional, because yes, I'm interested in intervening in public life. And so assisted street crossing, we offered, the piece was that we dressed in a kind of official city uniform. It wasn't actually, it was fake official, and then we would offer people lifts across the street. And that did come from a choreographic or dancerly background of having the experience of being able to lift and be lifted as adults, which is a very unusual experience, but wanting to offer a different perspective on how we trust each other's public bodies. And people took us up on it. And when they didn't, that was actually a very interesting conversation about why not and what was the barrier. So I think, yes, it's absolutely resonant, this idea of like, how do you allow for a different way of experiencing public life, whatever that might mean, and then how do you allow for a new kind of knowledge? So with Sunk Shore, we give a tour of the future of a very specific shoreline, and in the intention of that, right, is to be in the future, not to say this is what will happen, but to give some imaginative experience of what is going to happen or could happen, but as a present tense, so that you can look at your own shoreline and remember that, oh, I will be up to my waist in 2092, and there will be none of this, and it will all be in boats. So that it's so that it's an imagination of the future by being in the present, in the future. Anyway, I do think that creating the situation that is both open and specific is a very particular kind of approach to the idea of public work, right? As opposed to a large, as you said, like a large public monument. And I also think that for you, like, you do a lot of exploration of what we mean by intimacy, right? And so that brings me back to this other question, and to what you said about we are all New Yorkers, like, but how do you think that your specific growing up in New York influenced your artistic language, especially in this way that you approach intimacy as something that is both experienced and to be studied?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think so. Like relevant, salient details of my growing up in New York include that I'm an only child, and so I had to find playmates that were outside of my home. Certainly, like my parents were good about inviting kids over when I was younger, but like increasingly, I was finding playmates outside of my own home. But also that I had a pretty wide range of experiences of feeling alone in public space and using that as a place of like eavesdropping or self-knowledge, or, you know, just like a comfortable position for me is like walking down any street in New York by myself pretty much anytime. And that's where I do a lot of my thinking and noticing, right? Riding the train by myself, riding the bus by myself, going from place to place, biking, walking, like being in transit, surrounded by other people, but kind of in my thought and noticing space. So that's one really relevant thing. The other really relevant thing, and not just because we're at a Hunter talk, but like I went to Hunter my whole life, right? I went to Hunter starting in pre-K when there was still a pre-K program, and I graduated from the same darn building in 12th grade. And I never had to go to a new school until college. And I did not like going to a new school in college. So I think in terms of a sense of intimacy, right? Like I had a sense of shared intimacy with my classmates, with the building, with teachers and staff in the building, many of whom had known me since I was 4 and saw me through when I was 17, right? Mm-hmm. And that is a very unique experience, not unique only to me, but it's a very sort of specific and particular school experience, not just because of the strangenesses of the school itself, but just never having to transition to a different place. And so I think I've always noticed that there are familial aspects to the ways that we live together, even outside of the sense of living within our own families. And it's that plus maybe like a long cultivated interest in whether or not people who love each other are more the same or are more different that caused me to be really interested in intimacy as a topic. You know, my parents, other than that they're both quite short in stature, are really very different in almost every imaginable way. They both really like to read. They don't have nothing in common, but it's like usually if my mother thinks something, my father thinks the opposite and vice versa. And they're quite culturally different and they're religiously different and they're just different. And in my family, that's normal. Nobody in my family married or partnered with somebody who was from the same culture as them. In my immediate family, nobody. And so I was surrounded by lots of people who were really different from each other, who were also producing these kids who are not necessarily like either set of people, right? You know, I'm very different from my mother because I'm American and she's not. And I'm very similar to my father in that we're both born and raised in New York, but we're really different in other ways. And so I grew up with this idea that love was sort of about like difference. And then as I was getting older, it became clear to me that the larger cultural view is that love is sort of about becoming like the same as someone else. And I found that really confusing, legitimately just confusing and tricky to understand. And so in reconciling the difference between my own lived experience and sort of like what I was learning was a more culturally normative view of love, I think I got interested in intimacy and all the ways that we accept things that may or may not be true in our lived experiences, and like, what do we do with that? And it's all over the place once you really start looking. Lots of things that we think are normal that might really work for us are still not normal. And lots of things that we think of as normal that don't work for us are still maybe normal or maybe not. There's kind of every range of experience. Lots of things that work for us are abnormal potentially, and lots of things that work for us are normal potentially, right? So it's like based on your own individual, there's the normal abnormal plane, and then based on like larger society, there's a normal abnormal plane, and those are not the same thing. They're sort of like a quadrant chart that you can wind up in any section of like the culture matrix in New York Magazine.
Yeah, that's okay. Now I have three things I want to say in reply, but I'm gonna start with, I think maybe it would be interesting to go into your, to maybe another, I'm sure, very clear and succinct explanation of your rather ambitious project that started with the, I think they start with the Bureau of Self-Recognition.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So, which I participated in.
Yeah.
And was one of our first real encounters, I would say. So yeah, so do you want to explain that larger project that you've been playing out over a series of years?
Sure. And like now in my slideshow, suddenly it's useful that I have all these other kinds of images and like quotes from a totally different talk. So yes. I don't know that I have a Bureau of Self-Recognition image. Well, I do. I have this one, actually. This is one of the exercises for the Bureau of Self-Recognition. But the way that my practice overall works as an artist has been classified as something between like art and sociology. I have no sociological background or training, so you can think what you like. If you're a sociologist, I'm sorry I can't help you. But the way that I've been sort of engaging in artistic research is not from a framework of a particular discipline or a particular type of lineage artistically, but actually from thinking about intimacy at increasing scales of group size. So I started with a 2-year investigation of intimacy at the scale of the self. What is the intimacy between a person and themselves? And I did a project called the Bureau of Self-Recognition, which took a number of different forms. Clarinda, the one that you participated in was called Free Consultations, and it was kind of a therapy service. And this was actually one of the exercises that people did during free consultations, but I had 26 sort of clients or participants in the project who were doing exercises every day for a period of 30 days. Some people went longer, and kind of sending me the results of their exercises. So people would send me photos or videos, voice recordings, notes, sketches, whatever they wanted to make. And I would kind of collect these things, and then I displayed them. Other forms that the Bureau of Self-Recognition took were a bank, where people could bank hours of time only for themselves. So the idea, there's an idea called banking, which is a broader idea that I didn't invent, but time banking in general is sort of about like, what if, we bank time instead of money? Like, what if we're holding on to hours that we can use for other things? And it's kind of a format of engaging in shared work or cooperative behaviors. You can think of almost like working at the Park Slope Food Co-op as sort of like time banking for food, or time banking for discounts on food. Actually, you don't get food, you get discounts. But in my bank, you could save hours that were just for yourself. So like, I would not, as your banker, give you back an hour for helping your sister move, because that's an hour for your sister. Unless you're helping your sister move out of your house, then it's an hour for you. And the project took other kinds of playful, performative, bureaucratic formats as a way to engage people in sort of really analyzing what our everyday lives are like, but just sort of as individuals. Next, I did a project about one-on-one intimacy called the Book of Everyday Instruction. And the Book of Everyday Instruction was actually sort of 8 intersecting projects, each of which had its own central question. And the projects took a number of formats. These are images from chapter 1, which was called You and Me Together, where I placed an ad on Craigslist in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where the work was being sponsored. And I joined strangers in their everyday life doing things that they would normally do with someone else. They would swap out the other person and replace them with me. So that had a kind of one-on-one performative element, but the performance itself was not documented. Instead, other products were made out of those interactions, including these photographs that you see. But all of the projects for the Book of Everyday Instruction were about one-on-one intimacy. one-on-one though sometimes meant like me and another person or pairs of people who already knew each other, but sometimes it meant a kind of one-on-one intimacy, like the relationship between a person and safe space, or a person and their city, a person and their neighborhood. So there's all kinds of different layers of partnership that exist in the project. This is just a close-up of one of the photos. So this was an experience I had with a woman named Heather. She was 17, actually. She was not the youngest person in the project. He was 10, but we had to do it with his mom too. And it's the Polaroid that I'm holding. That's actually, it's a photograph that I took, but a photograph of my hand holding something. So my other hand is holding the camera. But the Polaroid that you see in my hand in the photograph is a Polaroid from that moment. And the text description is what was happening in that moment of the Polaroid. So yeah, Book of Everyday Instruction had lots and lots of different stuff in it. I installed some permanent historic plaques in Greensboro, North Carolina that document shared histories of life and work on South Elm Street. And that was done in partnership with Elsewhere and Art Place America. So there are 4 of these plaques that are permanently installed. This one is about Jerry, who you see in the picture next to his plaque. The plaque is installed for public view, but it's actually on the outside of his house. And it says, for 10 years, 4 times a day, Jerry Limonstall and his family's dog, Watson, took long walks through downtown Greensboro. After Watson died, strangers would stop Jerry to ask where the dog was, sometimes crying when they heard he had passed. Their walks were a part of this neighborhood. So it's plaques that are really dedicated towards things that we might know as neighbors, but are rarely commemorated. This one is Mary Wells and her antique store. Other parts of Book of Everyday Instruction included workshops where people could measure different distances of space between them and another person and kind of develop storytelling practices out of that. So this happened at the Museum of Modern Art. This is a video from that, which we don't need to watch. I did an installation in a bathroom. Well, actually, I did a number of these installations in bathrooms. This turned out to be really popular. I did not know
Yes,
so
it's
many
really
people
awesome.
wanted work in bathrooms, but I did this like for fun. This is actually the first time I installed it. I did it kind of like for a funny at Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. And it was for an open studios event that thousands of people came to. And so many people were like, they went into this was the real bathroom. This is not a fabrication. So when you went into the real bathroom, things like this would be on the stall shelves, paper, on the doors. And so people would use the bathroom and encounter the work, but so many people were like, yeah, I want this everywhere. So this exists in a number of places now, and there's a lot of these kinds of interventions. Yeah, maybe I'll leave this slide up, but you get the idea, right? The Book of Everyday Instruction had a lot of projects, but all of them were really about pairing. And then for the past little longer than I wanted, I've been working on a project called Obligation to Others Holds Me in My Place, which is a project about intimacy at the scale of the immediate family. But actually Wayfinding, the installation in St. Nicholas Park, is one of the sub-projects of Obligation to Others Holds Me in My Place. So it's really considering the familiar relationship between New Yorkers and sharing a neighborhood, sharing a park, sharing a city, sharing public space. So that's its own kind of familial intimacy.
And then you want to expand beyond that. No, right?
I do.
Yes.
So after families, I think I'll be doing, I teach in the studio art program at Queens College, go CUNY. And so I'm going to be thinking about sort of studio classroom sized groups, which is, in my experience, groups of anywhere from like 6 to 18 people. So kind of group sizes at that scale. Then I think I'll be thinking about groups of about 50. And then I'm going to kind of keep scaling up until I'm really thinking about the whole metropolis of New York as one group. And what is an experience I can make for one group in that way.
I appreciate the ambition of that vision.
I could die before it happens. You know, I'm open to it.
I think so. No,
Architects have all kinds of unrealized projects, and that's considered like normal and part of the field and good. So I don't see why artists can't sort of leave behind the same.
Well, it's funny. It's almost like every project is an unrealized project sometimes. I don't know. That's my feeling, because when I was making dances more, it became clear to me that I was making one long piece rather than a series of pieces or performances, because it was like that the idea the ideas keep recurring and shifting, and they're all part of a larger idea and investigation. So I feel like it's never over when you're thinking conceptually. And I think that's one of the things that you say about yourself and that I say about myself, is that we are conceptual artists, even though we work within realized productions, that there is a concept that has iterations. And I have several like unfinished projects because I don't know when the iterations stop, you know, like it could keep going. The concept continues to be valid even if the moment that it's in transforms. So
what's one of your unfinished iterations?
Well, I have a project that I started in 2002 called Salvage Salvation.
That's when I graduated from Hunter, 2002.
Yeah, as a child, well, teenager. Yeah. Yes. So that it began then, and it is about the metaphysics of discard. So I was thinking a lot about why do we need new things? What is our ethos around garbage? What makes garbage garbage? How can we transform that? It's since become a very popular thing to think about, obviously, but it was a little less popular then. But it had many iterations, and the most recent was just 3 or 4 years ago. So it keeps going because it keeps being relevant. Because I was thinking about it not just in terms of the materials, but in terms of how we relate to our own bodies that way. Like, why are we so afraid of death? Why can't we allow for illness within this culture? I think all cultures have a different relationship to sickness and death, but within this culture, there's a lot of there's so much fear around death and aging, and that bleeds into how we create our material lives, which then bleeds into the destruction of the planet, basically. So I figure I always want to get to the very root of the problem I'm investigating, right? And so to me, the very root of our problem with materials, beyond capitalism, but part of what capitalism creates, is the desire for the new, and it plays on our fear of decay. So so that like the salvage salvation in gently suggesting that maybe we can salvage, reuse, repurpose, think of material as something that has its own life and its own history, and re-engage with it in all different ways, is a different approach to how we think of materials and how we think of what we use in the world and how we exist in the world. So, but it's not over. Like, it could just keep going, right? We're always going to have to be thinking. I mean, I'd love a point when we don't have to be thinking about that, and we're getting closer. But anyway, but what I want to ask you, because of a lot of the things that you just told us about, and because of what I was thinking, is so, and this picture that's here is really appropriate, right? Is what is the function of play for you in your work? Because I think there is a lot, and I mean play not like, yes, it's fun, but like play as a essential human activity.
Yeah, because I spend a lot of my time now with a 4-year-old, like it's become increasingly clear to me how much really serious stuff we actually learn through playing. And I mean him, but I also mean me. And if that's happening for him and it's also happening for me, I assume that that's happened for a lot of other people at a lot of other ages and a lot of other places throughout human history, right? My experiences are not that unique. And so I think the thing about play that's really great is that it can actually get people to come closer to something that might be somewhat uncomfortable or kind of unfamiliar in a way that feels safe to them or good, because there's this concept that it's going to be fun, right? And a lot of times, especially for adults, I think, we talk about sort of adults having certain levels of like coping, right? How much of life is coping, and maybe a certain level of like like grin and bear it. But I don't think that adults are actually that much less fearful than children are. I think sometimes they're more fearful than children are. And so the more fear that we're kind of experiencing in the world, the less likely we are to come really close to things that are unfamiliar to us. So in emphasizing that my work is really designed to get people to look more closely at their own surroundings and really what they're putting into the world, good, bad, neutral, things we forget, things we want to forget, all kinds of other stuff, memories you haven't even had yet, right? Like, I need to get them to buy into that before that closer looking will happen. And so play has been a really good way of getting people to do that. Now, I find that audience participation is not a good way. Large scale public events with performance are not a good way. Asking people to participate in flash mobs or even to make a drawing in public are not a good way, because people experience their fear before they get there. But leaving clues, suggestions, or indications that you pick up on without knowing that you're getting involved with something, that has been a more successful strategy. And, you know, I hope that a lot of these works, whether you see them once or they live with you kind of long term, really get you to continue to shift your thinking, and that they're sort of permanently like grounding and destabilizing, because I think we need a lot of both in our lives in order to really deeply engage with the world.
That's interesting.
You were talking before a little bit even about like people who didn't want an assisted street cross, right? And there's this idea of public performance that's like, not me, not me, I don't want to, don't look at me, right? But like, what are some of the ways that you've found that actually do really move sometimes literally, or move more metaphorically, move people?
I was just thinking about that like, so a lot of when I was making performances, more like specific presentational performances and more theatrical situations, there was a tool that I thought of as the secret weapon that I called ha-ha-oh. That like, if you get people, especially in the US, and it's very different in Europe, and that's a different story, like how things land in different cultures when you're performing. But in the US, like the way in is through laughter. So if you're able to create a situation in which people are relaxed enough to laugh, then you can kind of get in, exactly the way you're saying, another mode, another suggestion, another way of thinking and being. And I think that most of my work is in that moment of play and interaction, like, and that's part of why I started doing more public work, because I wasn't interested in presentation in that way. I wanted to find a way to invite people into the situation. But I think I agree with you, like, it's not about presenting things in public, it's about how do you create the situation in a place where people are invited into an interaction. And so like the no, like the reason I say for assisted street crossing, like why the no is as interesting as the yes, is that when somebody said no, we didn't just go, okay, bye. We're like, oh, that's interesting, why not? You know, so that was part of the performance. It wasn't like, oh, okay, the point of asking people to do the lift was not the lift itself. And that's the secret, right? That it's in the periphery that you find what I would call the actual work, you know, and there's a shiny object and it's funny and people are getting lifted, and we had a little menu and little stick figures with all the different lifts you could have. So it was engaging, but it was actually in the work we were doing by negotiating with each individual person. And in general, to me, that's where like, it seems to me that it's invitation rather than confrontation that creates a real ability to shift. Like, we're really used to confrontation in this culture, especially in New York. So when you have something that is maybe a little more about vulnerability or a soft touch, like it creates a whole different mediated space that you can exist in differently.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I think You know, I think New York is also full of invitation, but it's not in a standard format. But one thing that I've been sort of considering more broadly is like, just because you want to be, you, any of you, me, you, Clarinda, you, audience people, you, whoever, just because you want to be loved in a specific way and somebody is offering you something that isn't that doesn't mean they're not loving you, right? And I think that New York offers a lot of invitation in that sense, where you really don't feel like it's an invitation to something that you necessarily want or can even see or understand, but it doesn't mean it's not an invitation. I wonder,
Yes.
should we invite questions from other people since it's almost the end of our hour?
I was just thinking the exact same thing.
I'm gonna stop my screen share so I can see the chat and see if there's anybody who has a question. I guess people can type them directly into the chat.
We can also unmute people, and then we can also bring people in with their videos to this portion. So I'm going to ask people to do that as I'm inviting them to do so. So we can have people come on board now.
Hi, different. Nice to see you.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Judy.
Hi, Clarinda.
So are there any questions or thoughts that anybody wants to share in our intimate little group?
We have more people, but some people are hiding.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I would
Totally
love
understand.
I would
Go ahead.
love to know how people responded to the carry me piece and to the bathroom piece. Did people leave objects on the shelf? Did people accept being carried?
You start and then I'll reply.
Okay. So I don't know if anyone left objects on the shelf because I wasn't checking. So somebody could have left an object and someone else could have taken it. And I'm open to that happening. But one thing I will say is that, so that the image that you saw has the text on the shelf, but there was also text on mirrors, on stall doors, on toilet paper. It was really kind of everywhere, but not actually everywhere. So some stalls had it, some didn't. And the place that I installed it that had the most individual stalls was at an art center in Queens called the Knockdown Center. They have these huge bathrooms because they have a big, robust gallery program, but also they're a concert venue. So they have these gigantic bathrooms for when they have concerts with thousands of people who attend them. And I put stuff in many of the stalls, but not all. And the toilet paper was in many, but not all. And I would see pictures on Instagram of people exploring the bathrooms. And I thought that was really great.
That's fabulous.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
We also have a question in the chat. Clarinda, you want to read it, or you want me to read it?
Well, Clarinda, do you want to answer the
I'm
other
going to
question
answer first,
Yeah.
and then I'll
yeah,
read
sure,
the
sorry.
question.
Yes. Go ahead.
So yes, a lot of people were carried. All kinds of people in all kinds of circumstances, and you never could predict who would say yes and who wouldn't. So it was pretty fabulous as a social experiment, and also just as a way to hang out with people. Because especially when I was doing, like, when we started, I was doing some of the carrying, and I'm a very tiny person. So the fact that they would trust me to hold their weight was really quite moving. So Peggy asks, I wonder if you're doing any thinking about how COVID has changed our relationship to each other as New Yorkers.
I think we're all thinking about it. I don't know that my thinking has been so productive, but it's hard not to think about, you know, like it's especially weird for me because I still technically live in New York. I'm like maybe buying an apartment in New York from St. Louis as we speak. So it's a very weird week for me. But at the same time, like I have been separated from the city for most of this. And we drove back twice to see my parents because I miss them. But you know, I haven't been spending the everyday reality that maybe you all have been spending in the city throughout the pandemic and kind of the major shifts that New York has gone through, to my understanding, between March and now. So I'm more selfishly thinking about my changed relationship to New York in this moment than I am about the internal relationship. But Clarinda, you've been there the whole time.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think about it, but it's one of those things where I have to see the end of the arc before I can really, you know, because I'm sure it changes things, but I also think we're creatures of habit. And as everything develops, so many parameters are up in the air. I mean, you could just list so many different parameters. So I think as an artist who works and thinks about space in urban settings, like, you really can't make any like, now we're gonna do, I mean, you could, but I think it's a bad idea if you're thoughtful at all, like, to make any conclusions. You can have a reaction. So, oh, I'll give you a good example. I was working on an enormous project, me and several other 100 collaborators, not 100, but a lot of collaborators, and the Department of City Planning was working on a project where we were going to walk all 520 miles of the city shoreline that was supposed to start in May. And that whole thing went online, but it transformed and it became something really special in its own right. So I think that that's the kind of thinking we're doing. It's very logistic, but it's really interesting to see when those logistics shift, how the form of the piece itself shifts. Like, to me, like, the importance of public art, like Chloe's piece, became so different. So there's a park called Socrates Sculpture Park, and that and Wayfinding, I feel like, were real solace for people who were searching for some kind of art experience. And so the parameters shift, the logistics shift, but I think in terms of creating something that reacts specifically, everything's too new and too strange. So
good, thanks.
And yeah, I'm sure not all of you are in New York, but maybe some people are.
Are there other questions or comments?
I have a question. I'll let you answer Jonathan's question first, and then I'll go next.
Oh, I
How's that?
just saw it. Okay, yeah. Okay, Jonathan says, Chloe, you mentioned that some of the art for the Book of Everyday Instruction was done in Cleveland, some in North Carolina, some in New York. I'm curious how you decided where to work on different pieces and whether you saw or felt any differences in the way you interacted with people in different locations. Especially curious about pieces and work you may have felt would have been less possible in New York. So I'm going to be really honest. As an artist, a lot of times where you wind up working is where we'll pay for your work. So at the time of working on Book of Everyday Instruction, I received back-to-back a commission in Cleveland, a commission in Greensboro, North Carolina, a commission in New Orleans, and a commission here in St. Louis, which is actually why I came here the first time. And so I made those decisions based on support. But I also knew that everything that I was doing during the time of receiving those commissions, I wanted to fit into the larger framework of the Book of Everyday Instruction project. And so I was making sure that I could do those works there. I was checking in with the institutions that were commissioning me to say, look, this is where I'm at. Can you take some of this? And mercifully, they all said yes. But I do think that things would have been different if any of them had been shifted, right? If I did the Cleveland project in St. Louis, it would have been different. If I did the New Orleans project in Greensboro, it would have been different. And I'm picking those two as first comparisons because it's like Midwest, the South, even still, so different. So of course, if I had done any of them in New York, it also would have been different. I probably, maybe not, would have done the Craigslist project in New York. New Yorkers they really like Craigslist more than people in Cleveland seem to like it, and they really use it in weirder ways, because I've done a different Craigslist project in New York. It didn't threaten my physical safety as much, but this was not my first time on the Craigslist merry-go-round. And doing a Craigslist project in New York, I had hundreds of people show up. I had thousands of people email me and hundreds of people show up to a thing that was not even real. So like, I didn't want to risk that in terms of joining people's everyday lives. But you know, the St. Louis project, which I didn't show on the screen, but which I think about a lot because I'm here now, was a project about people and safe places, and how we find safety and safe space within complicated cities, especially for people from different identities at different times, and who we find safety with. Because I think that there's been a lot of sort of unfortunate political consequences and legal precedent that come out of the privileging of certain types of safety and not others. So I wanted to talk about that. And doing that here in St. Louis was resonant because I was commissioned to do a work for the 2nd anniversary of Michael Brown's death. So that was here, right? But also I could have that conversation almost anywhere and have it be resonant. It would just be different.
Thanks. I will ask another question now, specifically about wayfinding. So I'm an exhibition designer for a public library. So
Oh, cool.
I'm all about people finding art in places they're not necessarily looking for it. So talking about having your artwork shown in a library or a park, or I don't know, this might not be the right era for some of the other Hunter alums here, but I remember seeing around East 94th Street, De La Vega's chalk artwork on the sidewalk. That was always an amazing thing to stumble upon as you were going to get a slice of pizza at lunch. So I'm curious about whether there was any interpretation for your artwork, like labels in the park or for wayfinding, and if so, what did they say? Who was in charge of writing them? Where were they? Were they all over the place? Was there one big one? How did you have the idea to interact with how people are interacting with your art?
So the Studio Museum, as the commissioner of the work, told me in no uncertain terms, but I also agree with them, but I did not have a choice, but I agree, that there would be 2 sort of informational plaques that were also put up, but we put them up in a totally different style so they would not be confused with being the artwork. So they have a more sort of like horizontal diagonal orientation rather than the straight vertical plane. And there's one at the bottom of the hill at 135th Street and St. Nicholas Avenue. And there's one at the top of the hill at 135th Street and St. Nicholas Place. But that's basically like the 2 hill ends of the park, right? And those signs are green and they have explanatory text and they tell people how to access the audio guide and they give a little bit of context for the project. And they have a loose site map that shows you where all the signs are. So like I said, it's really not a scavenger hunt, but even still people don't always see them. And I think that that was helpful because, you know, one of the subjects that we said we were going to talk about, but kind of didn't, and now we're running out of time, but is like what happens when you put art in places where people aren't necessarily expecting to encounter an artwork. And I do that a lot, and Clarinda does that a lot. But I think specifically within St. Nicholas Park and the context there, I was glad to have those explanatory texts that also say that this project is the stewarded responsibility of the Studio Museum and produced by me.
Thank you.
Maybe we can do like one more before we end. Is that respectful of people's time?
Yeah, I think so. If there is one more question.
If there is one,
I
yeah.
have one other tiny question as
Sure.
an exhibit designer. How did you choose which typeface you wanted to use for wayfinding?
It's highway Gothic. It's what's on all your highway signs. It's a messed up version of what's on all the highway signs. That is what it is. People don't recognize it because it's out of context, but it is exactly the typeface that is on every highway sign in the United States of America, as well as many international countries.
I never knew that.
Yeah, people don't, but it is.
I love that.
So, well, hey, Clarinda, thanks for chatting with me.
Thanks for chatting with me.
Sorry, I
This
was trying to get the signs. I was actually up there last week and I took a picture of the sign that Chloe was talking about. I was trying to get it on the screen, but I couldn't. So thank you so very much, ladies. Chloe and Clarinda, it was a very, very fun conversation to be part of. Thank you for taking your time and thank you everyone for coming. And then we have a ton of other events lined up for you to see this month, and then upcoming Decision 2020 is coming up this Saturday. If you go to our website, hchsaa.org, and you go to upcoming events, you can see them. And we have a lot of other fascinating speakers. And thank you, Chloe and Clarinda, again, the time. It was really, really nice to have you and have a very stimulating conversation, part of a very stimulating conversation. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for having
Thank
us.
you.
Bye, everybody. Be safe. Well.